Electronic music. What is it? How does it work? How is it learned? And can I do it? In this video, I'll attempt to answer, explain, and demonstrate the answers to those questions. So first of all, what is it? Electronic music originated in the rock music genre in the late 1960s with groups like the Doors, Yes, Moody Blues, and others who first started using the Moog synthesizer. But you'll notice that the word music is not in the name, and I will argue that digital audio workstation software is, in fact, a powerful instrument of music. So we'll put the ideas of an instrument and the ideas of music together, and we'll talk about the idea that music, among other things, is simply the manipulation of sound over time. How it works. Electronic music is really partly three different things. There's a technical aspect, which has to do with the software itself, with the science of sound and music synthesis. There's a theoretical aspect, which has to do with music theory and the principles of music. And then there's a process aspect, which has to do with composition, production, and mixing. Software encompasses all aspects of these. Sound, which essentially is a sine wave consisting of a frequency and certain attributes, and synthesis, which is the software and hardware mechanisms that create those sounds and control them. Music theory has to do with things like pitch, which governs melody and harmony, rhythm, which has to do with tempo, meter, articulation, and dynamics, which has to do with the softness and loudness of the music, and then sonic qualities such as timbre, texture, color. So we see here we have to have the technical aspects to consider and the musical theory aspects to consider. In the realm of process, when you're creating music with electronic software, it's talked about often as composition, production, and mixing. Composition having to do with actually creating melodies, harmonies, and musical progressions. Production really encompassing everything from the initial idea to the instruments you may put in, the sounds you may put in, and so on. Sort of the planning and making it all happen aspect of it. And mixing has to do with the more detailed elements of selecting sound effects, determining which parts of the song or the tracks will be emphasized, and really all of the detailed manipulation of the various sounds that are all working in concert to make a piece of music. So really, how it works is a coalescing of all of these factors: the technical, the music theory, and the process. So how do we learn it? Well, partly, and maybe most importantly, motivation. If we love music and we are intrigued by the idea that this can be a way to express our creative impulses and can be a creative outlet for us, we may be motivated to do it, and that will give us the drive and the energy to do it. I believe, after spending many hundreds of hours learning this myself, pretty much on my own, although I incorporated information from various sources, that self-education is really the way to become good at this, or to become competent to whatever degree we hold as a standard, and that really the effort is a journey. So you will learn things and then build on what you learn, enhance what you learn, develop new techniques, new insights, and so on. It also requires time. There is going to be a certain amount of effort and time that have to be invested. And there has to be a recognition that there are degrees of mastery. I don't think anybody can perfectly master all aspects of this coalescence of ideas, but you can grow in each one of them and become good and competent to one degree or another in each area. If you look at music from the standpoint of some of our most well-known performers and composers, Bob Dylan in the folk and rock music genre, he did not have a great voice. He was not a great musician from the standpoint of his instruments, and yet he was able to create some profound and great music that was appreciated by millions and millions. Stevie Ray Vaughan was an excellent guitar player, almost a savant, and was able to do things with a guitar that most people can't do that are professionals. The Beatles were very successful at kind of bringing together all aspects of this. They had a great creative compositional skill set. They worked together as a team, and they were able to come up with beautiful music that brought in many factors and many elements. So when you're creating music, no matter what the form of music or the method of music, my belief is you have to set your own standard. And whatever is good for you, whatever is an expression of you, that is going to be success. And can you do it? Well, as I mentioned before, it does take a desire to learn. There will be a learning curve. There's no doubt about that. It will take time and patience, and there will be times when it's difficult and you will have to overcome certain obstacles or certain blocks or certain inabilities. But with persistence, you can achieve success in this area, I believe. Again, to meet your own standards. To some degree, talent is necessary. So there's going to be different talents. Different people have different skills, different talents, different experience. Some people are better with software. Some people are gifted musically. Some people are good with traditional instruments and music theory. Some people are good planners, good organizers. They're thorough, disciplined. So there's going to be different skills and different talents applied to it. The main thing here, to me, is if you love music and you find that the autonomy and flexibility and power of this platform is intriguing for you, then your love of music will be the primary driver behind what you do and the level of success you can have with it. Okay, just preliminaries. We'll talk a little bit about key concepts, operational characteristics, and just become familiar with the terms that we'll use with electronic music. We won't be able to go into great detail in this introductory video, but I'll try and give you a good idea of what is needed and how this, really the needs are very minimal. Basically just a PC, a Windows operating system, Windows 8, Windows 10. It might work on Windows 7. I'm not sure about that as far as Mixcraft and the other options. And then the software itself, I use Mixcraft. I think it's a good way to start. It's inexpensive, so it's not a big investment. You can get a free trial for it. And then the entry-level software, I saw the price recently at $49, so it's really inexpensive. One of the others that you see, and there are several well-known ones, probably better-known ones than Mixcraft, but Ableton Live is another one that is out there for the Windows platform, and then it will run also on Mac. The hardware is basically, you'll probably need a couple of USB ports, one for your MIDI keyboard and maybe one for a mouse if you don't have a physical mouse. I kind of recommend that. On the Windows PC, I can't speak to the Mac as far as memory and storage, but on the Windows PC, I think it's a good idea to have an i5 processor, 8 gig of RAM and 30 gig of storage. This is just for having some space and having some capacity, but most of the current laptops, most current PCs, in fact, are going to have an i5 or better, so it shouldn't normally be a problem. Anything older than that or less powerful than that might be a little limited. You know, it's kind of up to you what you want to try it on. A monitor of some kind is probably a good idea. You want to be able to see and be able to zoom in, and might just be easier to use if you have a decent screen to look at. You'll need some space to have these things set up in a way that is workable. You can see from the picture here, this is what I'm using. I've got a small keyboard and a couple of monitors. You probably don't need two monitors, a headset, a laptop, and then just a space to work in that's quiet and where you have a little bit of privacy. As far as what you don't need, I would say you don't necessarily need third-party commercial VST synths. These can be purchased for reasonable prices, and they may actually have some very good sounds and some good options there for synthesis. But to get started, I don't recommend people invest heavily until you kind of know what you're going to do and where you're going to go with this. As far as what you might want, although you don't have to, but if you are a musician and you're going to stay with this for a while, you're pretty sure, I think having a 61 key MIDI keyboard is a good idea, and a good quality one would be fine, depending on what you do and what your intentions are. As far as the third-party synths, you can get Synth One for free. It's easily available publicly, and then you'll need to get the presets that go with it. So at some point, I may try and facilitate that for you and offer a link to get you the thing. You can get these downloads of thousands and thousands of presets, but there's honestly so many of them in there, and many of them are duplicates and so on, so it might be easier to have a edited down version of those presets. You probably don't need more than a few hundred at the most to get what you would need out of Synth One. Okay, this little segment here will be about the terms you will encounter in electronic music. In this video, we'll talk about the digital audio workstation has certain terms and things that it uses. They also have effects and synthesizer attributes, and we'll have sort of a demonstration of some of that on the screen. And then music theory has its own set of terms, so it can be a little daunting at first, but we'll go into each of these, and as you work with this, you'll find that you get used to it and it becomes second nature. On the platform itself, the software, you have two windows. The top window has your timelines, your virtual instruments. You can change this from looking at it from a time or a clock point of view, or beats, which gives you the measures, and you can see you've got 4 beats per measure, just like it indicates down here. You've also got down in the bottom window several options that are connected. So After project, you've got sound, which gives you the piano roll by default. Normally, that's where you are when you're changing notes. Here, you can change and add notes in this section, or you can actually unlock that and look at it from this point of view and enlarge it and make it easier to work with. Down here, there's another option, step, which is another view that I don't use, which just gives you the notes and notation in a different format. And then mixer, which is basically the project level view of the loudness or volume for each track. And then there's an equalizer function, which is a fairly simplistic one, which is high, medium, and low. And then you can do some controls down here as well if you wanted to. And then you've got library. So Mixcraft has thousands of different audio clips that you can actually bring into your music and use based on what you're doing. They will originate in certain keys, so you have this one in A and this one in C down here. And when you bring them up, they will actually be transposed to the key. Your project key in this case is A flat. Or you can just try the sound and play it down here. Okay, so that's generally the window view of the bottom. Also at the project level, you can look at settings that have to do with several things, but I'm just going to focus really on your VSTs, which is your plugins. And this will show you in Mixcraft how you control the directories it searches for, so they can be put into different directories, and then it'll scan for them and find them. So when you get VSTs, that's one of the things you would need to know here. And there's also another view here of just the plugins themselves, which ones exist, and then you can, I guess, activate or deactivate them or whatever here. So it just gives you another view. I don't use this very much, but I do know what's in there. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about synthesizers, synthesizer presets. So if you go into, just take this one for example. This one has down in the, it's a little bit small on the screen, but you have the instruments down here, and it shows you synth and preset. And so really a virtual instrument is a combination of a synthesizer and a preset. Now the synthesizers that are default with Mixcraft, not all of them, but a large number, are really, the synthesizer itself is not configurable in the same way that you'll see a couple of other examples like in Synth 1 or the ME80. So you have here, the synthesizer is basically Acoustica instruments, and then you can select, like this one is oboe, and you can select others down here based on what you want. So it becomes a virtual instrument once those two things are selected. To show you the difference, if you're looking at Synth 1, you've got the synth is Synth 1, the preset is eBass 1, and then if you hit you see an edit key is available here, and you can click on that and bring up the synthesizer itself and all the different options, oscillators, the amplifiers, different effects, and things that you can do to actually modify this. And then if you wanted, you could save it as a new preset if you want. So, and I've done that in some cases. Okay, so we'll talk now about effects and synth attributes. We talked about the platform, the software terms very generally, and then the effects and attributes. So under the effects, we're going to look at some effects, not all, just a few examples. The ones you hear a lot will be delay, reverb, chorus, distortion, and a few others. So if we go in here, again, this is Acoustica Instruments, that's the name of the synth, and the preset is oboe. And then there's various effects that I went ahead and just set up in here, so I use them as examples. So like here with delay, if you play this with just nothing, no effect, sort of sounds like this with two notes kind of playing together. If we want to add chorus, which is essentially adding some secondary and maybe more than two even sounds kind of combined, it'll sound like this. So that's chorus, just to give you an idea. Flanger is a method of distortion. I won't go into that in detail, but it adds a different effect. And then below flanger here, here's pretty much classic reverb. And then here's the 31 band equalizer. a function that you go ahead and you change in here. So by default it's flat. So there's a preset in here called flat, and if you play it, it's going to sound like it does normally. And then you can go ahead and select presets, or you can create your own. So I've got one called high pass, demo high pass. And what that does, it just takes all of these high frequencies, these categories of frequency here, and zeroes them out. And then if you want to do the obverse of that, we have low pass, and that basically nulls out the lower segments here. And there's all kinds of variations on the theme, but you can see how that actually works. Another thing that you see, a term you hear, is tremolo. It's one of the attributes of sound. And I'll just show you kind of an example here on the ME80. And just listen to the slow sort of change in the tremolo. So by manipulating the synth settings related to some of the characteristics of attack, sustain, recover, decay, and maybe others, there may be an oscillator change, you can make that effect. You'll hear the term sine wave, which is a fundamental element of sound, and the different kinds of sine waves with synthesizers. Oftentimes you won't need to know this, certainly at the beginning. Later on you may be exposed to some of this as you get into more details playing around with synth settings, but you can have a pure sine wave, a square sine wave, a sawtooth, a triangle, a pulse, and so on. And there's other aspects of the sound that you can change. Pan has to do with panning from left to right in a stereo way so that sounds can be heard sort of a little bit alternatively on left and right. Detune has to do with how much the tone varies from the frequency, its set frequency, and sometimes you want that, a little bit of that gives you an effect. And then you have sidechain compressors, which essentially prioritizes that with the other tracks so that the compressor will sort of subdue one part of the music and let the other part come through or get priority. And then you have Spectrum Analyzer. I'll talk about Spectrum Analyzer just a little bit. What I did here is set up a submix here called Spectrum Analyzer, and then I put all of my tracks that I want to analyze underneath that. And so if I bring up the analyzer, I go into, there's some advanced effects here with the Pro Studio version, but you can get to it the other way as well. So you click on Effects. Here's Voxengo, Spectrum Analyzer. I click on Edit. Now I have the Spectrum Analyzer up. And now everything underneath this subtrack mix will show up on the analyzer. So if I play this just at the project level, everything will kind of show up here. So what you want to see is the separation of sound there. You may see where certain frequencies may even be too hot. You may see some other things that you don't like, but good separation between frequencies is one of the reasons I like to look at spectrum analyzers. The other thing is you can use the synthesizer itself, and this is one of the advantages I like with Synth One, which is a free synthesizer. Here it is. Okay, so we'll bring up Synth One with eBass 1, that's the preset. If we edit this, this is the synth interface configuration window. You can see the presets here. I'm using eBass 1. There's actually a total of potentially of 128 presets in this one library, and there's other libraries too. So I've got this group here. So each one of these is a preset, and some of them are set up. In fact, all presets in this context are used to describe an instrument or a sound. So you can have something that sounds like a bass or a lead guitar, electric guitar, an organ, and so on. Okay, so in this case I've got it set up a guitar type of sound, and if I play that sound, it'll just be something like that. And if I want to change the I'll play a couple of notes and then just experimenting with the interface here, I can go down to essentially this is like chorus, so it says unison. It's got 8 simultaneous instrument sounds. And then if I go up here to chorus flanger, that has another slight effect. I can also go up to effects up here. And then there's several different settings up here under effects. I can take these off, just like that. The other thing is arpeggiator or ARP. You'll see that term fairly frequently, and that basically just takes the same note based on a certain beat setting. Here you can change the frequency of the beat and gate and so on, and then it'll also affect how the arpeggiator basically works by changing the octave variable and the randomness, or the up and down variable. So if I take a couple of notes, play those, and then I click it on, and I can also do that with my other features. That's an idea, at least, and different synthesizers will have different interfaces. So that's synth 1. You can also look at the ME80 down here. His interface looks like this. You may not have the same options here, but you have some of the same things, some of the same characteristics. For example, attack, sustain, recover, delay. There's some things related to tremolo. But in this particular synthesizer, the options have to do with types of sound, like string sounds, organ sounds. There's something called funky, I think you can create, and then it will mix a couple of these to make a kind of a combo sound. So a lot of this you won't change really very often. Maybe once you get into it more deeply, you will start playing around and finding some sounds that you like, but that's the options that are in that particular synth. And like I say, in the Acoustica synth, the default synth, you don't necessarily see that. You see it down here in the effects, and then those effects can be modified. So if I want to change it from an Acoustica instrument standpoint, I can go down and change whatever effect I have and change the settings up here. But it isn't quite the same as Synth 1, where Synth 1 basically gives you all the dials and knobs for the complete function of the synthesizer, which you can get in trouble sometimes. It won't really do what you want, or you may not understand what it's doing, but it does give you complete control. Under music theory, basically it's just concepts that you may or may not have been exposed to, like time signature, beats per minute, and beats per measure. And then you get into the music theory part of it, of major chords and minor chords, major third, perfect fifth, the notes that are in your major chords. And then you also have things such as note length, the root key, scales, and things like this. Some of these you will learn on your own. I will talk about music theory to some degree here, but it's just sort of get familiar with the landscape and the different terms, and we'll go from there. Okay, we'll just talk a little bit about digital audio workstation software and music theory. For brevity, I'll just use the term DAW for digital audio workstation. And before I talk about music theory, I just want to mention there are several options out there for DAWs. I use Mixcraft, and it's a good platform. I like it. It's simple. For me, it was easy to learn, but you may want to look at options just to evaluate what works best for you. So if you want to learn on Mixcraft, that's great. I recommend that, in fact. But I think if you want to go seriously more into this, then before you invest a lot of time becoming sort of expert on Mixcraft, that you look at some options. Ableton is one. There's the Apple Logic, and then there's others, but there are some less popular ones that are, I would say, suspect in terms of, their future and their usability and everything. So you might find a lot of different options out there. I would try to stay with a somewhat stable company that has the support and will be around for a while. So the common elements on DAWs really are just simple things like they're going to have synthesizers, they're going to have virtual instruments, they're going to accommodate third-party VSTs, which includes third-party synthesizers. They're going to provide for all kinds of different sound control and effects. And you'll have the piano roll mode for editing and so on. So I don't really think that that's the issue. It's really just the look and feel. Some of the platforms are maybe a little more graphical in nature, and you may prefer that. I've heard people say that Mixcraft was a little bit more mouse-centric. That may be somewhat true, but I think it just has to do with the knobs and dials and how you want to actually work. So that's part of it. Like I say, and the other thing is on Ableton and a couple of the others, they are more integrated for collaboration, so you have multiple teams working on software or on a piece of music at the same time, and so it's kind of built into the cost is that scalability part of it. So just as an independent producer, you may not necessarily need that feature. Okay, music theory, really music theory and melody, or melody theory. I'm not going to go into this in great depth. I think it's something you really have to explore and learn on your own if you're not a person who's had training in music theory or in music generally. But I do think it's important. It's part of what you need to do. So if you're going to, learn to do this, then you'll need to operate the software. You'll need to sort of employ your own creativity, and then you'll want to bring music theory into how you're doing things. It's a three-legged stool scenario. So what I try to do here is to help you avoid some of the learning curve, some of the pitfalls, and make it easier so that if you want to do this, you'll be able to move into it and get going. I'll talk about basic music theory. I mean, basic music theory is relatively easy to learn and understand. I do recommend that people, aspiring music creators, that they don't ignore it. And if you're already well versed in music theory, you'll know most of anything I'm going to tell you here. I was not music theory savvy when I started. I had always been interested in music, played some guitar and harmonica and stuff like this, and loved music, but I didn't have the training that some people get maybe when they're in school or maybe otherwise, and maybe they took piano lessons. I don't focus on theory, whether it's melody or music theory itself, but it is a consideration when I'm composing or when I'm creating something. But, it can be a little bit of a rabbit hole too. So it's just good to balance it out. I think you need both, and it's something good to keep in mind. So basically, music theory for me is the most fundamental part of it is just the keys and the scales. When you start creating something, you'll want to decide right away what key you want to use. You set the project key in the software, and I try to use different keys. I don't want to be stuck on one key. I might happen to favor certain keys over others. The keys do vary in terms of the sort of the mood or the type of music you might want to create would be more accommodated by certain keys. But generally, just knowing the scale, knowing the root key, dealing with establishing the root key when you're developing a melody, and being familiar with the scale so that you can kind of improvise if you need to on the keyboard. That's basically what I do. I try to keep an image of the scale of the keyboard on the keyboard so that I can kind of reference that if I need to. I'll also, practice the scale a little bit so I'm kind of ready for it. I know the scale fairly well and can kind of improvise by ear at that point. And as far as establishing the key, you use the root key early in the piece, using the length of the key, and it's the human mind wants to establish for itself what the key is going to be, so it has an expectation for what sounds right, at least in the Western musical tradition. So we want to set that up and use the key early on and kind of repeat it through the piece. That's just typically what you do. I'll just show you this brief clip from a piece that I did to sort of support this video called Timeline, and it'll show you how A flat was established for the key. The other thing in music theory is the chords and the terms that go into the chords. So it's good to be familiar with the principles of the major chords and how it's set up. There is a formula for determining what the chords are, and there are 7 basic chords or standard chords for each major key. So just understanding that and knowing kind of the sounds of those chords and the relationships is good. One thing that I kind of recommend is, if you don't know this already, is just to look at how the major chord is actually established. And basically it's just this. They take the root key, there's what's called the major third, which is 2 full steps up, and then the perfect fifth, which is 3.5 steps up. So that's how the major chord, number 1, is established. Again, there are 7 chords with the keys, and you have usually established or usually identified as Roman numeral 1 through 7, but the major one is the first one, number 1. And just so you know, if you're totally not knowledgeable about terms in this area, every note on the keyboard, black and white, is separated by a half note. And then when you skip a note or skip a half note, then that's a full note. And so you have what's called whole notes separation, or a whole step. So when you say step, you're just saying basically a whole note, and it's 2 half steps. On melody theory, there isn't probably a good, single correct theory of melody. There are some videos on YouTube about melody theory, and it's fine to be familiar with kind of the idea. I usually have my own approach for it. I think it's good for everybody to have their own approach for developing a melody, what works for them. Oftentimes I will experiment a little bit with a bass line progression of some kind, in the key, and then I'll use a rhythm track of some kind, and then I'll improvise with sort of the lead instrument to try and come up with a melody. That's sort of my process. Everybody might be a little different. In different pieces, you might take a different approach. So it's more or less make it up as you go kind of a thing. Melody is important. Just to have the basic theme of your music, of your piece, you want to have the melody established. Like I say, most of the time I improvise and then I elaborate on the melody. Most of the first version of it, and I'll go through this in subsequent videos, but the first version of it is hardly recognizable for what may exist later. It's the sort of the beginning of it, and then there's a lot of editing and improving and enhancing and elaborating on that. And you can see that in this example I'll show of Beethoven, just the notes as they're played at the outset of Beethoven's Fifth. And you can see it's really just 4 notes that are played, and yet the way he elaborates on it is really quite remarkable. So I'll just play that real briefly. So Beethoven took this very basic melody and he introduced it, he extended it, and elaborated on it. If you listen to the first part of it, the extended part of the Fifth Symphony, you'll see how that works. And there's a lot of different themes to how you do a melody. So you'll come up with a basic melody. You may create a couple of different variations on it and then reuse those throughout the piece and do elaborations and changes to those elements as well. So it's a variability. There are different ways of approaching it and doing what you like. It's mostly just coming up with a basic melody and then making the music what you like, what you feel sounds good. Just a brief, I almost hesitate to go in here on modes, but it's just something to be familiar with. If you study music theory a little bit, you'll hear something about modes. Basically, it's just to show the variability in the human mind about how we perceive music and so on. So the modes are basically just variation on how the scales are identified or defined. And so most of the standard music that we think of as normal are based on what's called the Ionian mode. And then there are other modes that there are several modes, and mainly this is based on the Western music tradition. There's quite a bit of information on the internet if you want to really read about modes, but I thought I would just show, if you're interested in it at all, you might get a little confused about modes, and so I thought I would show show an example of 3 modes and the scales of those modes and how they are have a different sound to them. And you can kind of imagine how that would affect the music that would get created with them. There are popular music pieces that were created in different modes, and if you weren't aware of the whole idea of modes, you probably wouldn't even be aware of it, but it's just an item of interest, and I thought it might be worth mentioning here. Okay, let's talk about preparation. And really, preparation in this context is learning the platform, learning the DAW, and really it's kind of an analogy to learning this is what it takes to learn to drive a car. Because of the number of elements involved, the process of learning electronic music is similar. Driving a car, for example, when we first start especially, we see this, but it requires us to orchestrate several activities at once. We've got the gas, we've got brakes, steering, signals, instrument panel, mirrors, other drivers, road awareness, being able to anticipate things, and even the vehicle condition. So you're really handling several things at once and in dynamic time. So it's a challenge to learn to drive. That's why people take a while to learn when they first start. But eventually we do learn the skills to drive, and becomes almost automatic. It is like that with electronic music. It will take some time. When you learn how to drive, you'll get a permit, and you'll just drive around the block or just down the street on a residential street, and it may take you a year or more to really become comfortable on the road and learn how to navigate yourself and do the things you need to do in order to pass the test. And for the new driver, over time, there are just a lot of things that he will learn through experience. You get a driver's license, and that's really just the permission to drive. You're considered safe enough, but there's going to be a lot of things that you'll learn over time. Things like learning the best routes to take, what the road conditions are and how to deal with that, where traffic is worse and at certain times of the day, how to avoid risk generally, what things to look for, blind intersections, and just a lot of things that I can't even think of them all, but there are just a lot of things you learn over time, and it's probably fair to say that you will continue to learn as long as you're a driver. Electronic music is going to be like that too. I continue to learn things all the time. So there's a learning curve, but that's fine. It's fun to learn for me. I like to learn new things. There's a lot of styles of learning, and this is really, like I've said before, a do-it-yourself kind of learning process. So you have to really make the process your own. I try to give you information and tips and things that I've learned in the process, and then you go ahead and do what you need to do to work with your particular learning style. Like I say, have fun with it. I got into this because I saw the potential of it, and I thought this is really remarkable that what can be done. I could see that some really interesting, fun things could be done for a person that loves music. So that's why I have gotten into it and spent time on it. And you will have to spend some time learning how the instrument works. And like I say, that may take you several months to a year or more to get to the point where you feel like you can really do the kinds of things you want. I'd say to start out, spend some time learning the instrument, learning the different settings and basically the interface with the software. But at some point after the first few hours of that, maybe create a piece of music. It doesn't even have to be good. It just needs to have the basic elements of a piece of multi-track music, and that's the way you're going to learn, and then you can start building on that. So in effect, it's like driving with a permit for the first several months or maybe 6 months or so, and then you'll start to find yourself being able to create music or do things that you really want to do, and it won't be as time-consuming and as difficult as it may seem at the beginning. And you become more comfortable with the functions and the controls, and like I say, you're continuing to learn all the time how effects work, how the synths work, how sound relates to the various elements of the song, and so on. You also will be able to develop your own particular processes that work for you. I'll talk about that in a minute as far as version control and keeping track of your files and knowing where things are. And then overall, I just look at this as a journey and exploration, sort of an adventure. So there's no time constraint. This is really something you're doing just for your own edification, for your own expression. Have fun with it. So just in brief, learning to navigate, part of it is going to learn the synths and the presets, as I've mentioned before. I'm going to demonstrate some of this just briefly in a moment. The sound control and effects, and just knowing what those elements are, what kinds of effects they have, the relationship between an effect and the actual sound and the synth sound, being able to work with multiple tracks, harmonizing those tracks, working with them, like I say, saving your work, naming conventions, version control, having shortcuts to things. You'll work out ways to make that process easier, because you're probably, if you're like me, you'll end up creating several things and then you have to go back and make changes, and you want to be able to keep track of where you are and what track you're working on and which version and so on. And you'll have your own approach to creating music. I will suggest a basic starting point, and then from there it's going to be largely an individual process for you, what works for you, and a creative process. I would spend some time looking at the synths and the sounds, but it can be a little bit daunting at first and almost become a rabbit hole. You can see so many sounds and you don't even know how they might be used. You really have to look at individual sounds, even individual presets on synths, and then look at their sound based on the duration of the note and the octave that you're at. So you won't want to spend a tremendous amount of time at first, but you will over time, and even in the first few months, you'll want to learn a little bit about the different synths and sounds so that you have a good repertoire of things to pick from when you want to actually create something that you really like. But that's an ongoing process as well. I'd also say in relationship to the sounds and the synths is you're going to be thinking about how they relate to melody. Certain sounds or synths might be good for melody, some for bass line, some for rhythm, some for other added effects and harmony. So you might want to even keep notes. I mean, at some point, I've tried to do that, but I think it can be a little difficult at first. But after you get to the point where you kind of cull it down to where you have maybe 20 or 30 or 40 different sounds that you like, you can keep track of those somehow. It'll help you to bring things back. But that's a constant challenge, remembering the name of a preset and then remembering the sound that it makes and the effect it has based on note length and all that is a little bit difficult to keep that all in your head. So I think at this point I will just give a demonstration and we'll talk about that and then go on to the next. Just a very basic beginning here. When you bring up Mixcraft, you'll have probably 3 acoustic piano tracks and an audio track. The acoustic piano track is the acoustic instruments, that's the name of the synth, and then the option or the preset is for the piano. So the sound is basically like this for default. And we want to change that and then play with some presets. So what you'll quickly want to do is just set up a little bit of piano roll here, and I'm going to set up 4 bars with the mouse down here, and then I can just drag this over and I'll unlock this here, and then I can expand this a little bit, make it easier to see. Just pick some notes in the high, medium, and low range. I'll go up to maybe C5, and I'll just have this selected. This little pencil here will actually note on that. You just put that right there at the beginning and it fills the bar based on the setting here. So that's at C5, that's the octave, C5. I'll go down to C3 and do the same thing, but I'll put it in the second measure. It's a little lower. And then C2 will be the lowest I'll do. So we've got D flat in 3 places, and if we play it, I'll dock that. Now we want to change the synth. The little icon here indicates it's a piano. Doesn't really matter, but that's what it'll look like. It can change based on what you want to do with it. The column at the bottom here where the mouse is says synth at the top. Click the little down arrow and here are your synthesizers. I'll pick ME80 version 2, and the default preset over here in this column is Blade Runner After. And I want to change that, so I click the down arrow, Blade Runner Aftertouch it's called, and we'll go down to Sigur Rós Ballad, and that's the sound, that's the preset I want for that synthesizer. And now we can look at some of the synth settings. Before I put a synth setting on, I can just play it here down at the bottom. Just that one box will play. This right up here is the only thing that will play when it's selected up at the top if you hit the play button within the piano roll. So that's our synthesizer and our preset, and then the effects we want. We'll start out with classic reverb. Let's see what we get here. I'll edit that, and then I can play up here. That's high frequency dampening. Here's reverb. Wet and dry has to do with before and after effects. That's good enough for now. There's different reverbs you can use. I just picked the simplest one. The next effect will be chorus, and Acoustica Chorus. If I hit the edit button here, that's the config. All the Acoustica effects have the same kind of a looking interface. Let's play it with that. Actually, I'll take that out, and then we'll play before we put it in, and we'll hear what the effect is. And then we can make some adjustments here. And then we'll play just for a second with delay. You have to be a little careful with delay. It can actually not help you much, but I'll play it without the delay. Here's the delay. And then I'll modify delay a little bit just to see if I can get a better sound. So, just to show how the effects are done, how they're modified, how you listen for them, that's what you have now on this first track. That's from within the piano roll. If you want to play from the project level, if there were any other tracks, it would then play them with the other tracks as well. Okay. Coming up, we'll talk about the techniques for creating a rhythm track, melody, bass line, and sound control. But when you first start out, you'll have an empty project file. When you start the software, it'll come up with blank settings, basically empty tracks, and some default synthesizer tracks. There really isn't a lot to do when you first set up the software prior to starting this whole process, which we'll go into. The one thing you need to pay attention to is the key, and selecting the key or deciding which key you want to use. It's very simple. I've shown this in the prior sections, but the key setting is really on the main window there at between the piano roll and the timelines, and you can just put your mouse on that little button there where it has the D right now, and then you can go up or down and make the key what you want. The key is mainly important for importing tracks, importing clips in audio format, and so the software can detect the key, and it can detect the beats per minute, and transpose to whatever your setting is in the project itself. The little arrow here I'm showing on the left hand side, you can open up this view here, and it'll allow you to define how the tempo and project key relate to whatever the imported tracks are. So it's just a good habit to set the project key correctly before you really do anything, because you might end up wanting to import a clip and you don't want to have to worry about the transposition part of it. As far as picking the key, it's really up to you. You may have a preference for certain keys. I happen to like the black keys, the sound or the tones of the black keys, but you can have a mixture of both. And I'm just showing here that it varies, and you've got a chart here which indicates this, what's called the circle of fifths. So you'll see that at the very top is the key of C, and all the keys, all the notes are white for the key of C. And as you go around the circle here in the major keys, you'll have one more sharper flat as you go down all the way around to F. And so F has only one flat key in this case, which is the dark keys. I don't recommend necessarily going into a minor key unless that's something you particularly want already. It's just a preference of mine. It's easier. It's really up to you which way you want to go with that. Another aspect of this is housekeeping and just having a naming convention for when you're storing your project files. You can use any naming convention you like. You'll find it's convenient to have a naming convention just because you'll end up classifying things or prioritizing things and sorting things, and so you'll want to have a convention that makes it easy to find things. As you go into this, you'll be creating, maybe at the beginning just experimental tracks, experimental music, and then later on you might start developing your own music, and you're going to want to be able to find things and have a place to store things, uniquely identify them in kind of a logical manner. In this case, I'm just showing what I do. You don't have to use this at all. You can use a completely different mechanism. Most of this doesn't really come into play that much unless you're getting down the road and you're changing how you organize things. But essentially, I just have the beginning letter as a way to classify it. There's a sequence number, which may not change while I'm working on the project itself. The description, it may be soundtrack, it may be something else. So you can put a description in there if you like. Most of the time I just use the word theme, but it could be anything. I do use this nomenclature here most of the time. So there's two letters that I use to identify every unique track, and that will be in the directory. So I'll be able to identify, if it's A, B, or K, L, or whatever it may be. There's a sequence, and so I'll be able to keep track of it by that unique identifier. And then I put the name of it, and I may not even have a name at the beginning, but at some point I'll put a name in, and that's where it would go. I'll sometimes not do this. I try to put the key in there, so at least I have a reference for what key I was using, and then put a version number. So I may have many, many versions of a piece of music, and I might want to go back, or I might want to look at what I did earlier on, and so I just keep those versions. It's not really necessary to keep the versions. Sometimes it's convenient to be able to look back. Part of the name can be used for the directory. So in the Mixcraft projects, they'll be found in the documents folder under Mixcraft projects, and then you'll have a place to put your project files. Normally what I'll do is just call them theme dash, and then it'll have the two unique characters. And that directory will have my files, which will be the project file and the WAV files that go with that and all the versions. It's really just housekeeping, but it's good to have a system because after a while it gets a little confusing to remember where everything is.